All right, well, let's get started so we make sure we have enough time. Welcome, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. We're excited to have you here for the discussion on strengthening identity security. Now, in today's session, we'll be diving into the recent Osterman research, share insights, and explore strategies to gain visibility into identity-led threats through adding layers of protection, governance, and automated response. Afterwards, we'll have some time for Q&A. So with that said, Josh and Mike, if you'd like to start and introduce yourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And I'm Josh Parsons, product manager here at Anzilic, and we help organizations mitigate the top breach vector by hardening authentication and blocking account takeover. And to start off here, Michael will give an overview of the research, and I'm going to return at the end to give you some actionable steps on protecting your organization. So Michael, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Kim. Appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk through the research that we have recently completed together. I'm Michael Sampson, Principal Analyst at Osterman Research, and I was the lead analyst on the research that we're talking through today. For those of you that are not familiar with Osterman Research, we're a market research company focused on delivering insightful research that impacts organizations. Most of our focus is around cybersecurity and identity security as it becomes a bigger issue in the marketplace and of interest to threat actors has become a more significant research topic for us in recent years. And Josh, I think this is the second time you and I have been on a webinar about identity security in about the last 12 months or so. I think you and I did one around MFA last year. And for those on the call that did not hear that, I'm sure you can find that on the Exotic website and the associated research. The research that we'll be talking through today is around visibility, governance, and autonomous remediation. And for those of you on the call today, a copy of the report will be sent to you after this webinar. Let me tell you very briefly about the way that we collected the data for our discussion today. Osterman Research ran a market survey in the United States of identity leaders, CISOs, and identity infrastructure leaders and managers. In order to take the survey, they needed direct responsibility for identity security. We were interested in organizations with more than 500 employees, and across the 126 survey responses, the average number of employees was 2,300 or so, and it was a cross-industry survey project. The key findings from the research, and some of these we will be talking about, but not all of them, are as follows. Attacks on identities and identity protections are escalating. I'm sure for those of you who are on the call, you will be seeing this in your own organizations, and as we talk about in the report, and as we draw in data from what we see across the industry, this is the pivot point really for why identity security is becoming so important, which would lead us directly to key finding 2, is that among the organizations we surveyed for this research, the importance of identity security technologies is rising rapidly. One of the interesting findings that we will talk through, Josh and I, over the time that we have together today, is that despite claims of high maturity with identity security deployments, when I did correlations across the survey questions to look to see whether there was evidence to back up those claims of high maturity, often there was a significant gap between what identity leaders were saying was in place and the reality of what was happening for them as an organization. And at Osterman Research, we feel that one of our key responsibilities in market research is to highlight areas where there is a significant difference between what a leader says they think is true and then the reality or the analysis of the gaps in their posture. It's important for us to say, hey, there are things here that are not working as well as they should, despite your belief that they are, and we would encourage you to make sure that you harden and strengthen your processes in this place. The fourth key finding is that improving visibility into identity threats is a fundamental piece of work. And then finally, identity configurations and identity platforms need resilience and recovery options. Now, Josh and I have a very limited amount of time together today to talk with you around this research report. We will talk through some of the data in the report, but Josh and I will not be covering everything. And so when you get a copy of the report, please have a look at that. There will be many additional data points that Josh and I do not talk through. Identity security, what is this thing? Maybe we could just start with something of a definition of what this is about. It's very much an emerging area in cybersecurity that focuses on protecting identities, both human and non-human. There are capabilities like assuring only authorized access to resources, preventing credential misuse, protecting against lateral movement, and helping teams detect and respond to identity-based threats. It is not the same as identity and access management. The two are complementary, and the growth is very much in identity security across the market today. Some of the situations that we write up in the report around the need for identity security, one example, this paid $2,760 was a case from Brazil where threat actors offered an employee $2,760 to be allowed to use their credentials, and as a consequence of that, then stole $140 million from Brazilian banks. Another data point that you can see here is 11.8 billion records, and that was one of the breach data sets that was released in 2024. Of the 11.8 billion records, 6.4 billion had email addresses associated, and 2.4 billion had a password in a usable form as well as part of that. And those numbers are significant in comparison to the population of the world. And so with that just being one breach data set, this issue around credentials that are compromised and the flow-on implications for threat actors, which they're delighted with, would be one thing we could talk about. But the flow-on implication for organizations is that if this is a reality that is happening for your organization, and it most likely is, then being aware of that as soon as possible and doing something about it to minimize that risk to your organization is of critical and high importance. The 50-to-1 is a reference to non-human identities. So for every one human identity, we're at the point now where there are 50 non-human identities in organizations. These are things like API keys, and AI agents have identities associated with them. This number of 50-to-1 is expected to increase significantly over the next year or so, particularly as AI agents become more online and embraced within organizations. And the 40% refers to a recent study that said 40% of non-human identities did not have a clear human owner for them. And therefore you have the significant and growing identity space where credentials and access are less well managed than for human identities. And the question is how threat actors will be able to use that to compromise data and systems. And finally, the 110-500-3 is that in the last 3 years at Fortune 500 companies, 1 in 10 employees have been implicated in a data breach that has resulted in their credential being available for purchase or sale on the dark web. And so that's a significant challenge for Fortune 500 companies, with at least 10% of employees being involved in that. The solutions that we're talking about from an identity security perspective to protect identities, both human and non-human, are the three that are talked about on the screen. One is solutions that give visibility into protected and unprotected identities, embrace some form of risk scoring to say this particular identity is at higher risk of causing significant or extreme bad negative implications to your organization. Visibility is also about looking at the dark web to understand where credentials are available that have been compromised, and also around behavioral baselining to assess what identities do normally and when those patterns of behavior deviate from normal patterns, to flag that as a potential compromise that needs to either be autonomously remediated or flagged for attention by a human agent. So that's the whole area of visibility and identity security. The second is around governance, and this is about ensuring that people have the correct access levels for their current roles. It's about formalizing onboarding and offboarding processes so that identities and their associated permissions exist for as long as they need to, but no longer. And as employees change job roles in organizations, that their identity scope is resized as soon as possible so that they get correct access to what they need for their new job role, but access to data which they're no longer authorized to see as a result of changing is removed from them. And then finally, autonomous remediation is about the growth in identity security capabilities that provide both preemptive protection to flag when things look as though they are turning negative, as well as proactive remediation once something is determined to be negative or in not good practice for the organization, to do something about that as quickly as possible. The first data point I want to talk about from our research is that identity protections are very much under attack. Here are some of the key findings that we saw from the data. Identity is very frequently a root cause in breaches that ranges across market research studies from somewhere between 70% and 90 or 95%. We see that advanced phishing attacks are increasingly focused on including MFA bypass capabilities. And this was the report and research that Josh and I talked about last year. And again, I'd encourage you to have a look at the NZOIC website to see that. Credential stuffing as a service offerings are available for new entrant threat actors to quickly gain access to significant capabilities to seek to compromise organizations. Threat actors are aggregating data breach records to create advanced profiles of target victims. And finally, the use of agentic AI by threat actors. We see early evidence of that beginning to increase. Now, Josh, these are fairly significant trends across the market around threats to identities and protections. Credential stuffing as a service, hackers aggregating breach data. How do you see exposed passwords fueling these attacks and the risks that flow as a consequence?
Yeah, I think when we think about things like credential stuffing, something that organizations wonder is, hey, we've been monitoring our environment, there's been no intrusion. How are our credentials, how are passwords in our environment becoming compromised? And that allows us to talk about one of the big problems here, and that's a problem with password reuse. We know the vast majority of users reuse passwords across multiple sites, either reusing the direct passwords or some variation thereof. And when users reuse passwords, you're sharing your security with whatever website or service those users are reusing it on. So in their personal life, with any personal sites they go on and reuse those passwords or credentials, you are then sharing your security with those environments. And they may not have the best security, and there are new data breaches every day. And you can see how that can open the door to account takeover. because users can correlate either the password or full credential pair to your environment. And when you combine that with MFA bypass, you can see how compromised accounts are going to be inevitable unless you have the right protections in place.
And Josh, that whole area of reusing passwords or deviations of a base password, I mean, I'll tell you that that's what I used to do, not now, but many years ago, I used to do that. So yeah, absolutely, it's a very common practice, and it makes entire sense that if there is a data breach implicating another organization where there is an email address for one of your employees and a password for that employee, that if that has not been done correctly in terms of unique passwords, then absolutely this is going to be a significant issue for organizations. This slide presents 3 of the data points from the research around external threats and internal shortcomings. 58.7% of organizations say that cyber criminals have become more interested in stealing and abusing compromised credentials over the past 12 months. 56.3% of the organizations in this research acknowledge that they cannot detect exposed credentials in a dark web forum almost immediately, i.e. within hours. So sometime longer than that they could, but they can't do it immediately. And as an implication of that, there is an open scope for threat actors to move much faster than organizations do and compromise and steal data and move laterally and so on. And then finally, 93.7% of organizations in this research said that they were concerned about account takeover attacks due to compromised credentials in the next 2 years. Josh, is there anything that stands out to you about this or that you'd like to add on this slide?
Yeah, I would stress that organizations, when looking for compromised passwords or credentials in their environment, they should measure the success of remediating those compromised passwords in minutes and hours rather than days and weeks. Because as soon as there's a data breach and there are compromised passwords and credentials out there, attackers are going to work very quickly to exploit those and be able to access those accounts. So as we'll talk about a little bit later, having automated remediation and continuous monitoring is very important. And also with the last data point there, that organizations are really feeling the pressure of compromised credentials. And this is a problem that has been around for a while, and it has increased over time. So this isn't going away unless you address it yourself. And what I hope to show folks today is that it is possible to address this problem. You just need the right tools. And I'll show you some free options as well as some more advanced ones to be able to tackle this problem head on.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And it strikes me that the dynamic that we're seeing here, where threat actors would be able to move, or it would be in their best interest to be able to take compromised credential pair and seek to use that within minutes to hours. If organizations are taking days to weeks to do something about the publication of that credential, it's exactly the same dynamic as what we see in another area, which is around vulnerabilities. That often once a vulnerability notification has come out, organizations take days to weeks to months to deal with it, but threat actors are much faster at doing that within minutes, within hours. And so this space between what threat actors are doing and what organizations are doing, this gap between these two is creating incredible opportunities for threat actors to do things that are not in the best interests of organizations. In the research, we asked respondents to indicate how they saw threat from a number of identity attacks changing over the past 12 months. Now, the scale in this, the dark orange, is increased significantly. So phishing attacks against our employees that seek to compromise credentials, this is 9.5% saying it increased significantly, 19.8% it increased moderately, 27% it increased slightly, and 22.2% it didn't increase at all. So that's what it means. Overall, 50% across this, more than 50% have seen increasing threat across all the different types of identity attacks that we asked about. The top three here, phishing attacks, zero-day exploits, and unauthorized changes to identity attributes have increased the most. And then finally, the highest intensity ones, those that increase significantly, where that number is the highest. Personalized attacks enabled by AI, 19.8%, that was first place, saying that that had increased significantly over the past 12 months. Ransomware-based malware, 15.9%, saying that that had increased significantly. And then threats by, or attempts by, threat actors to socially engineer help desk workers to reset a password, or MFA factors, 14.3%, increased significantly over the past 12 months. And I'm sure for many of you on the call today, you'll be able to think about some of the coverage that's been in the news over the last 3 to 6 months, highlighting some of these challenges. One of the key findings that we said was around visibility being a fundamental and key control for organizations. We asked the respondents to indicate the percentage visibility they had across a number of different areas, and I've got 3 groupings of those for you. These 3 areas here: service accounts, non-human identities that are taking actions or behaving in unexpected ways. That's the first one. Authentication session tokens being used somewhere they shouldn't be used. And then 3, employee credentials that have been compromised and are available for sale on the dark web. All 3 of these give the sense of active threats that are being actively and currently exploited. And on average, only 19% of respondents to the survey said that they had 100% visibility into those particular things. MFA posture is a big issue for safeguarding credentials. This is about which high privilege users are not using MFA, something that you want to know so that you can do something about that. What types of MFA factors are being used by high privilege users was the second one. And then there are 2 others. The last is which employees are not using MFA. So the first is which high privilege users. The last was which employees are not using. Now the average is higher than the previous one, 27%, but it's still not high enough. With MFA, the details matter. So types of factors that are being used is a very important one. And so you can see here that on average, only slightly over 1/4 of organizations have 100% visibility into what's going on with MFA. There is a third grouping of those, and I would just refer you to the white paper to look at those. We asked respondents to give us some sense of the barriers that were stopping identity threats, and you can see here the 3 top ones are around no automated remediation capabilities. That was an extreme issue for 14.3% of respondents. 17.5% said that it was an extreme barrier, or 2 things were extreme barriers. One was manual processes and hence a long investigation time. And then the third was there's no budget to allocate to this type of project. And when I look at that, there's very much a relationship between those. If there's no budget, but you're relying on manual processes, then it's very much that you have no automated remediation capabilities. And I guess this becomes then a signal or an opportunity really for organizations to go, is there a different way of approaching this? I mean, we would assert that improved manual processes will not solve these 3 key issues here: preventing lateral movement, lack of visibility into identity threats, and lengthy investigation times to identify compromised accounts. Of those and other things here, relying on manual processes going forward is not going to be a successful strategy for organizations, and something needs to change. This research focused on an evolving slate of protections for identity security, and I've grouped the the level of importance of, I think it was 14 or 15 different characteristics that we asked about into the identity solution, the identity security solution areas that they would normally go under. And I've mapped here the growth in importance from 2 years ago to currently and expected in 2 years. And you can see that in general, overall, there's alignment in terms of a significant uplift in importance for identity governance and administration, identity threat detection and response, detection of compromised credentials, and identity security posture management. Slightly less important is backup and recovery of identity platforms, and whether that actually turns out to be less important or organizations realize that that actually is a critical thing to deal with, remains to be seen. If we do the research again in 2 years, it'll be interesting to see how that works. We asked respondents to give some sense of status of deployment. On average, across the different identity security solution areas that we asked about, 50.1% said that they were currently deployed, 47.7% on average said that they intended to deploy over the next 12 months. When we asked about maturity of the deployments, and it would indicate that only those that were currently deployed did we ask about maturity. So 67.5% said that they had currently deployed something to do with identity threat detection and remediation. And we only then asked that cohort, that group of the survey respondents, about the maturity of their deployment. So on average, 41.9% said that their current deployment was highly mature, 26.7% said that it was extremely mature. Now, the last one here, detection of compromised credentials on dark web forums, 60% in total said that they were very or extremely mature. That's the claim. But when I did the correlations across their answers to other questions, actually only 22% show real maturity. So let's dive into that now and have a look at what that actually looks like. So the high maturity claims often lacked evidence across the data set that we got. 67.5% of using identity threat detection and response claimed high maturity. 60% of those saying that they were using detection of compromised credentials claimed high maturity. 71% of those with backup and recovery of identity platforms claimed high maturity. When they did a correlation for the identity threat detection and response area around visibility, many of them lacked 100% visibility into identity threats across the various ones that we looked at. Many lacked confidence in detecting misuse of valid credentials. For those that claimed high maturity for detection of compromised credentials, many lacked visibility into compromised credentials. Many were unable to detect credential exposure immediately, and many lacked confidence in the ability to detect the use of compromised credentials. Same pattern for backup and recovery. But when I correlated those data points against the claim, for those that said their ITDR deployment was high maturity, actually only 42.4% of those gave evidence that that was happening for them. And the biggest variation was the 60% who claimed high maturity for detection of compromised credentials. Actually, only 22% of the data set, once I did those correlations, gave any evidence of having high maturity. Josh, I'm sure you have a view on this.
Yeah, and that is quite the drop-off there when looking at detecting compromised credentials.
Absolutely.
We're seeing the most disparity in claimed maturity versus actual maturity. So it's important not just to have visibility into compromise, but it's important to ask yourself, is the list of compromised credentials I'm comparing my own passwords against continuously updated? Is this list high quality? And does it continuously check against our own set of passwords? So whenever you evaluate a tool to help you detect compromised credentials, those are the questions you should ask yourself.
Thank you. Now I think I have one more slide, and Josh, we're going to hand it to you. The status of deployment for those who were not currently using a given technology area. We asked for respondents to give some sort of indication of when they intended to deploy that. And you can see that overall in the next 12 months, many of the organizations that are not currently using these technologies intend to have something in place, which very much highlights the growing importance of identity security and the need to drive elevated maturity. So, Josh, you're going to talk about roadmap for strengthening identity security. So I'm running the slides. You'll have to tell me when you want to move to the next one. Let's go.
Sounds good. So as we transition now, let's talk about how we put this research into practice with some actionable takeaways on how to protect your users and your organization. So we can dive into the next slide here. And going into this first area, detecting misused compromised credentials. Well, as Michael shared earlier, threats against identities are escalating, and cybercriminals are more interested in stolen passwords than ever. These passwords are the keys to the kingdom, and once they're compromised and posted for sale, the clock is ticking. In other words, you need to know immediately if a password has been exposed and have a process to neutralize that threat. And as I'll talk to you in a little bit, this is what we provide here at Enzoic, and I'll show you how that works in practice. But the takeaway here is that detecting compromised credentials isn't just a one-time project. This should be an ongoing, continuous effort, either from your team or to have the right automated tools in place. So we can jump to the next slide here.
They're coming across to you?
Yep, just popped up. And the next area that we see here is to stop lateral movement and privilege escalation. So once an attacker gets in, often by using a compromised credential as their entry point, their next move is to escalate privileges and move laterally through your network. And some of the key requirements here are also to invest in detection of compromised credentials on dark web forums. And you're probably beginning to notice a pattern here. Stolen passwords are often implicated in many attack stages. It's often a point of entry, but it can also be used to move laterally and gain additional privileges. So we can move on to the next slide here. And that brings us to the next focus area, which is capture identity signals to assess exposure. And this is about visibility, gathering signals from across your identity infrastructure to understand potential weaknesses. And the research found that many organizations still lack an autonomous response when something is flagged with an identity. Whenever you have something that's not autonomous but relies on human input to remediate, there is a latency there, and that latency does introduce risk. We can move on to the next slide here. And this is another example of the gap between actual maturity and claimed maturity. If your visibility isn't where it needs to be, you're going to miss a whole lot of things. And most teams can calculate who's at risk, but far fewer can see enough signals consistently and respond automatically. Even the organizations who rated themselves as advanced or very advanced at exposure scoring and response still had, on average, less than 75% visibility. So there is a big visibility gap here. And that brings us to the next slide. And the next area is enrich identity security detections and policies. This is where external threat intelligence really comes into play. And the research advises organizations to leverage external breach intelligence and data feeds to enhance their internal security detections. And there's three requirements here. use external breach intelligence, correlate that external data with your user accounts, and integrate those signals into automated identity policy enforcement. And those all build on each other. We want organizations to move across the screen and do all three of those, but only about 30% of organizations are doing all three today. And Zoic is a great example of a tool that checks all of these boxes at once. We provide that external breach intelligence feed. We're constantly updating it with newly discovered compromised credentials from the dark web, from paste sites, from the ClearNet, Telegram, you name it. We then correlate it with your user accounts by hashing and matching passwords through a partial hash comparison. So it's privacy safe and secure. And finally, we remediate any instances of password compromise automatically. So that brings us to the next slide, which introduces Zoic. And I've been hinting a little bit at what we do here at Zoic. So let me talk about how we address some of these challenges. And Zoic focuses on protecting organizations from compromised passwords, account takeover, and data breaches. And we do this by zeroing in on your number one risk factor, which is the problem of compromised credentials. And why is this your number one risk factor? Because if an organization can log in as an authorized user, they can often evade a lot of traditional security measures. Our mission is to make sure that doesn't happen. And we do this in a very simple way. Zoic maintains an up-to-date database of compromised credentials that have been leaked in data breaches, posted on the dark web, or obtained by other nefarious means. We're talking many tens of billions of credentials actively being tracked, more added every day, and we integrate these insights directly into an organization's login flows. So Zoic is constantly answering the question, are any of our users' passwords known to be compromised right now? And if the answer is yes, we take action. And our goal is to give organizations proactive, real-time protection against the use of compromised credentials. So let's take a look at some other research in the next slide. And when we say compromised credentials are your top risk of a data breach, this is well known among the top resources in the industry. So for example, the Verizon DBIR report found this year, for the 11th year in a row, that compromised credentials are once again the number one cause of a data breach. So this risk isn't something that's just going to go away. You can't just wait it out. This has been a problem for a while. It's only increasing, and it's 2025. We need to make sure that we have secure passwords. So let's look at in the next slide how we can address that. And this shows how Zoic works in practice with a secure login flow and password reset scenario. And imagine one of your employees is logging into a company application and they enter their username and password as usual. Now, behind the scenes, Zoic is checking that password against our live database of compromised passwords. If the user's password is safe, meaning we have not seen it in any breach, nothing changes about their login experience. They sign in as normal. But if that password has been exposed in a breach or appears on the dark web, Zoic can immediately intervene. Depending on your policy, we can block the login outright and prompt the user to change their password. And we can do that by also requiring an additional authentication step, however you would like to set it up. And this prevents an attacker from using that same password from getting in, and it alerts the legitimate user that their password is no longer secure. And now consider the password reset or creation process. When a user is choosing a new password when setting up their account, Zoic checks the new password in real time. If the password they picked is found in our breach database, Zoic will reject it and tell the user to choose a safer password. And the result is a much more secure authentication process with minimal friction for users. And there are very few security controls you can put in place that are going to feel very invisible for your users and ensure a seamless experience. So this is something that not only will your security teams like and prevent a data breach, but your users won't even notice unless their password is compromised. And let's see what this looks like visually in the next slide. And on the screen here, you'll see a user login example illustrating this. And anyone can go to demo.nzoic.com/login to test this out. And you can even do it live right now and follow along with us. But in this example, an employee attempts to log in, and it turns out their password was found in a recent data breach. And as you can imagine, this particular password here isn't the most secure.
Are you telling me that I'm not allowed to use that password, Josh? Ouch.
So it looks like we have Michael's password there, and that's the cybersecurity equivalent of leaving your keys in the ignition. So if Michael were to use that password in a login flow protected by Zoic, Zoic's API detects that immediately. And in the next slide here, we'll show what happens. And to no one's surprise, this password was previously compromised. And as we can see, the login is halted and the user gets a notification that their password is compromised and must be changed. This happens all in real time. And one thing I want to stress is this isn't just a one-time scan or a periodic check. This is continuous monitoring. So passwords that were safe yesterday might show up in a breach tomorrow, and Zoic is constantly watching for that. Let's take a look at the next slide here. And we allow you to reset the password in real time. And using our passwords API right in the password reset flow, the end user can see with each keystroke if their password is secure and meets the policy requirements. So you wouldn't just be able to reset your password to password 1234 exclamation point. It would tell you that that password is compromised, doesn't meet the policy requirements. So this helps train the user in real time as well to set a secure password. And we do have a pre-built solution for Active Directory that we'll see on the next slide. And this is our Zoic for Active Directory Lite solution. This is the free version of Zoic for Active Directory. And I want to show you this because almost every organization of a certain size uses Active Directory. And it is a substantial risk if any of those passwords or credentials become compromised, because Active Directory provides so much access into the organization. And this tool here pulls from Zoic's threat research database to tell you how many compromised passwords you have in your environment. And I do want to stress that with this free tool, it is a snapshot of risk. If you want to achieve maturity in this area, the full solution in Zoic for Active Directory is what you need. And that will bring continuous monitoring, automated remediation, full credentials monitoring, so you can specify to monitor a username and password combination, and a host of policy options, as well as predefined templates for miscompliance. But in our free tool here, we have some very nice reporting capabilities built in, so we can make your job easier for making the case to your management to purchase the full solution a whole lot easier, which brings us to our next slide. the tone at the top is very important. And right now, executive intensity is rising, with over half of executives ranking identity security as extremely important. And this makes sense because everyone sees the massive data breaches in the news and how they damage those companies, damaging valuations, reputation, and you can measure that in dollar amounts. And it's often on the order of tens of millions of dollars. And every day on LinkedIn or executive news sites, you often see news of a data breach. There's a recent vulnerability just today from OpenAI that I saw in my LinkedIn sidebar. So this is something that executives are taking notice of. And there's a good justification for strengthening security and avoiding the costs of a cyber attack. But within Zoic, we've noticed those benefits, and customers have also noticed benefits with reducing the amount of manpower needed to achieve normal security operations. So some outcomes customers have loved were reduced help desk calls. Users have an easier time setting their passwords because we have the as you type functionality that gives instant feedback. And this is real value that you can feel through your organization. And if you run that free AD light scan I showed you to demonstrate the risk of password reuse, and you can show that to your executives, we found a very high success rate of getting in Zoic approved. So that brings us to the next slide here.
And just before I jump to the next slide, Josh, one of the things to point out that this slide hints at, and our listeners can see this in the report, is that the importance of compliance-driven reasons are declining year on year, whereas the importance of security-driven reasons are increasing year on year in terms of intensity. Compliance-driven reasons are often just a checkbox kind of approach. Yeah, we have this. Yeah, we have this. But here you can see the growth in intensity of security-driven reasons. We need to strengthen security. We want to avoid the costs of cyber attacks. And that movement among executives is really good to see.
Yes, that's very, very true. And to wrap things up here, I think the question attackers are asking is why work hard to break into your environment when they can just simply log in? And the takeaway I hope folks can walk away with is that you need the right stack of technologies protecting identities. IAM isn't enough, and you need to make sure automated detection and response is central to your strategy. And if you want the best password and account takeover protection, be sure to check out it in Zoic. The free tool and the full Active Directory product is self-serve and free to get started. And we would also love to hear about other use cases you have around login flows that you would like to secure. And Michael, before we jump into Q&A, are there any final thoughts here you would like to add?
Yeah, thanks for that, Josh. I guess for those listening today, it should be very obvious that threat actors are weaponizing compromised credentials and their identities. We see that in the news, we see that in the research. It just makes sense that, as you said, Josh, it's much easier just to log in rather than to try to break in. And while IAM, yes, is necessary, it's no longer sufficient. And so for organizations that are wanting to get ahead of the curve on this, making sure that they have the right identity security investments in place, maturely deployed, mature processes, elevated protections, now's the time to act, to do something about that. And Josh and his team at Zoic have a very good offering to help you on that journey. But yeah, let's jump to Q&A. Is Kim going to come back and tell us what's been asked while we've been talking? Hey, Kim.
Absolutely. Hi. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. We do have time for one or two questions. The first one I have, Michael, I think goes to you. Question was that your data shows low visibility into compromised credential use and MFA posture. Which of those two areas do you see organizations struggling with most, and why?
So low visibility into MFA and compromised
Compromised
credentials.
credential.
Yeah, which is more difficult?
Yeah. Which
Yeah,
one
look,
do people struggle with more?
Well, I think that the MFA one is probably an easier one to solve because you have, all of that data is within your own organization to go, how do we see who has been enabled for this, what factors they're using, and so on. In comparison, the compromised credentials one is not something that organizations can do by themselves. They will need a tool such as what you offer and others offer in order to get visibility into that. I think the compromised credential one is the more important one to deal with strategically. I think the MFA one is, I don't want to say it's unimportant. I think it's critically important, but I think the compromised credential one is the one that you'd want to move, a step or two quicker on than the MFA one.
Great, thank you. And then Josh or Michael, Josh, I think this is more for you. How do we integrate external breach data into our controls?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what I would do first is look at where it's easiest to integrate these controls into your logging flows, and also where it's going to have the most security benefit. And for security benefit, I would certainly look into accounts in Active Directory being a very high priority target, as well as any other login that gives corporate level access, whether it's a particular set of users you want to prioritize protecting or a system you want to prioritize protecting. You can make sure you're actively monitoring for compromised credentials and remediating them before they become a problem. And I would just stress that this is the most direct, foolproof, and easiest way of using external breach data to protect those systems. But you want to make sure that the data set you're using, since there are new data breaches every day, are continuously updated and remediation is automatic and fast.
Thank you. Thank you both for making those points. Really appreciate it. I think we're just going to stop there with questions. If anyone else has additional questions, please feel free to reach out. Michael, Josh, it's been great to have you both speak with us today around strengthening identity security. I really hope everyone was able to gain some insight. And again, if you'd like to connect, please drop us a line on LinkedIn is great too, or an email. If you can all please keep an eye out, we'll be sending out an email with the recording as well as the full research report that you can review. Thank you all again for your time and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Josh.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.